Hello, my name is Nick, and the topic I will discuss today is the opioid epidemic. But first, I'm going to give a quick background on the topic. So for those that do not know, opioids are a type of drug. There are legal and illegal versions of the drug. An example of an illegal opioid is heroin, but there are also a lot of legal opioids such as fentanyl and OxyContin. The legal versions are usually used as painkillers. However, since they are a drug, there is a serious risk for addiction. These drugs are supposed to be used only in severe circumstances and in rare cases, but a disturbing trend has emerged recently. Beginning in the late 1990s, there was a large spike in opioid use all over the United States. In fact, according to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, every year since 2000, there has been an increase in opioids being manufactured, being prescribed by doctors, and tragically, in opioid-related deaths. In 2002, approximately 20,000 people died because of opioid addiction. The death count has risen almost every year, and in 2017, the estimated number of deaths was over 72,000 people. After researching this topic further, it appears that there is only one conclusion that can be made. Pharmaceutical companies cause the opioid epidemic. Over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to describe to you the actions of the corporations that created and distributed these dangerous drugs, and show you how it makes them responsible for what has unfolded. The first company is Purdue Pharmaceuticals. Purdue's marketing practices over the past 2 decades misled consumers and doctors about their products, and as a result, many people have become addicted. In 1996, they released a new drug called OxyContin, which was a prescription opioid painkiller. Immediately following the release of this drug, the company received reports of OxyContin pills being stolen, sold off to black markets, and that people were crushing the pills and snorting them. Now, a proper response to these widespread reports would probably be to recall the drug, attempt to make it less addictive, while at the same time warning people about the potential hazards of using it. Instead, Purdue did the exact opposite. They responded with a rigorous advertising campaign and claimed that OxyContin was less addictive and less prone to abuse when compared to their competitors. The main selling point of OxyContin was that it could apparently relieve pain for 12 full hours, while all other painkillers could only last around 6. Luckily, a ton of previously confidential reports from court cases and investigations regarding Purdue Pharma and their drug were released about 2 years ago. There are almost countless complaints from doctors and patients that say the drug wore off much quicker than 12 hours. There are also clinical trials that were done before and after the drug was released, and many patients never got 12 hours of relief. Despite this, the company continued with their 12-hour claim and told doctors that if patients weren't getting 12 hours of relief, that the dose needed to be increased. This is clearly problematic since higher doses increase the risk of addiction, overdose, and death. According to experts from the FDA and Theodore Cicero, a neuropharmacologist at the Washington University School of Medicine, the practice of taking a dose of OxyContin, which is the chemical brother of heroin, at 12-hour intervals as advertised is almost the perfect recipe for addiction. Patients who do not get the 12 hours of pain relief will see a return of their pain and will begin to suffer the symptoms of acute withdrawal. In 2014, there were about 7 million patients in the United States who had been prescribed OxyContin. About half of these patients were prescribed doses of the drug that the CDC labeled as dangerously high. As a result of the marketing by Purdue Pharmaceuticals, who claimed that OxyContin was a less addictive miracle pill that would last 12 hours and provide consistent pain relief, OxyContin became America's best-selling painkiller, and the company reaped $31 billion in revenue. Considering the number of deaths and addictions caused by prescription opioids, it is not a stretch to say that Purdue Pharma is at least partly responsible for the widespread outbreak of opioid abuse. Purdue is not the only company that engaged in troublesome behavior. Other pharmaceutical companies saw the success of Purdue and their drugs and copied their approach to marketing. A prime example of this is a company called Insys. An in-depth New York Times investigation by Evan Hughes explains what this company did to increase profits as much as possible. Insys was a relatively small business 6 years ago when they released their only product, a new opioid known as Subsys. The company was in financial turmoil and needed the drug to sell well. So under the disguise of speaker programs where drug companies pay doctors to get positive speeches about their product, the company invited a ton of potential prescribers of their drug to private dinners. Many former employees have come out to Evan and explained what happened at these dinners. Essentially, the employees would discuss with the doctors about how much money they would both make by forming a relationship. One former employee told the New York Times writer what the leader of the Insys sales force, Alec Berlikoff, told her and her coworkers about their role. He said, "We pay doctors to write prescriptions." Now, there are ramifications to these actions. Subsys, the drug that Insys employees were bribing doctors to sell, is proven to be incredibly addictive and was originally supposed to be used for terminally ill cancer patients. Despite this, the company did everything they could to widen the reach and to get people with moderate and even minor pain on their drug, and it worked. Subsys was prescribed to patients that it was never approved to treat tens of thousands of times, and many of these people ended up addicted to it. Purdue and Insys are not the only pharmaceutical companies that participated in this kind of behavior. These companies and the people that run them consciously made the decision to put profits over the well-being of the general public. Because of their actions in purposely manufacturing these dangerous addictive drugs and in some cases using deceptive marketing practices, tons of people now find themselves addicted and many have already lost their lives.
Okay. Right, Nick, there's a little bit of setup of the background on this particular issue, describing the need for painkillers. Then you kind of introduce the drug that is the issue, that is basically the subject of your argument. You do have a very distinct and definitive statement of the proposition early on. There's not really much of a preview of the supporting structure, and it turns out that the supporting structure is largely circled around the companies that do this as opposed to a specific practice or specific actions or a trend. Those things are used in general to indict the companies on these sorts of things. Now, I don't mean to minimize the scope of the problem or suggest that there isn't an issue that's going on here, but the number of deaths that you were talking about and the number of people who are addicted versus the number of people who are taking it, I think you need to emphasize that point a little bit more. You have one statistic or one piece of information that suggests that it may have been responsible for 72,000 deaths over the last few years. That's a pretty substantial number of fatalities connected with this. It might be useful to make a comparison to other kinds of pharmaceuticals and show the frequency with which they are used and the number of deaths that are happening. Because I don't really know if this is outside in proportion to the number of drugs that are being prescribed. And like I said, mostly you're focusing on OxyContin at the beginning, and it sounds like all the other companies are using their similar or generic alternative, I guess, to OxyContin to get the same sort of effect. The supporting points mostly seem to be the companies that you're talking about. You mentioned the two companies in particular. The third point does suggest that there are some other potential consequences, but those are barely discussed. Most of it is really about the nature of the comparison of use of these drugs with either other drugs or non-use of these sorts of things. And that's the other thing I think that would form the basis of a reservation argument. What would these people's lives be without access to this sort of drug? That I think is one of the things that needs to be a consideration in questioning whether or not there's an adequate balance on the drug use that's going on here. Let's see. Like I said, the secondary points mostly just seem to be focused around the particular companies as opposed to the inference that their practices are having a particular effect. You kind of take it as a given that because they had speakers bureaus or because they suggested people take more, that's what caused it to become so much more widespread and popular. I still have my doubts about that, but I think that you have a couple of pieces of information that suggest there may be a connection there. The background information is okay. For the most part, you sort of explain how these drugs work and what it is they're supposed to accomplish. You mentioned that they're the best-selling painkiller on the market, though. See, that's one of the other things. If they're ubiquitous and lots of people are using them, but the number of harms is relatively small, then there might be a difference between the number of people who use it and the number of people who end up abusing it. And I think we need a little bit more data on that. If half the country is using it, which seems a little high, but you did say it's the best-selling painkiller in the country, then what percentage of the population has the kind of addiction that you're talking about and is using it for reasons that are not really called for clinically? The presentation, there's basically no audience contact for the whole presentation, and I think that that makes some of the transitions between the secondary points a little complicated, because they don't sound like they're advancing an argument. They just sound like they're a further description of a situation. And I think you need to be making inferences as well as providing us with descriptions of people becoming addicted to OxyContin. This would be one of those places where some examples and then follow up with the evidence would help quite a bit. All right. Thank you.